Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to Dr. Mark Lewis of the Purdue Applied Research Institute about the future of hypersonic weapons, whether the U.S. will catch up to China, and how the Trump administration should construct the Golden Dome missile shield. And we break down the U.S. airstrikes on Iran and questions about how effective they really were, along with President Trump's eventful trip to a NATO leaders summit in Europe. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I am joined, as always, by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. Almost news overload this week, and of course, as predicted by us on last week's show, we had major developments on the U.S., Israel, and Iran front that happened within about 36 hours of the episode coming out, but such is life, of course, in the media business. We'll unpack the latest on Iran here in just a minute, and then we'll talk to Dr. Mark Lewis from Purdue University, which is really, I think, as good a deep dive interview into hypersonics as you'll find. So stay tuned for that. But before we get there, Guy, first things first, as always, what's on your radar right now?
Thanks, Ben. It's great to be here with you for another week. There are several things I'm tracking, and the biggest is the question of whether the wave of U.S. airstrikes that hit Iranian nuclear sites on June 22nd actually damaged those sites to the level that President Trump and his top advisors claim. There's been a lot of messaging hype about this, Ben, and the reason is that an initial assessment of the strikes by the Defense Intelligence Agency got leaked, and that initial assessment suggested the strikes were not as damaging as Trump administration officials claimed in the hours right after the strikes. Following the leak of that initial DIA assessment, President Trump and Defense Secretary Hegseth have sharply criticized the media for playing up what they say was not solid intel that was in the assessment. Interestingly, Ben, CIA Director John Ratcliffe, also a Trump appointee, has entered into the fray. He issued a rare statement on June 25 that says outright that Iran's nuclear program was, quote, severely damaged, end quote, by the airstrikes. Ratcliffe's statement suggested that rebuilding the nuclear sites would take years. Having reported on the CIA and U.S. intelligence for around 20 years, Ben, I can tell you that this statement was what I like to describe as an information mop-up mission by the CIA director. On one hand, it was meant to back Trump and Hegseth, but then in a more subtle sense, the statement was about messaging to major media outlets that U.S. intel is actually still assessing the damage from the strikes. Ratcliffe's statement said that, quote, the CIA continues to collect additional reliable source information to keep appropriate decision makers and oversight bodies fully informed, end quote, and when possible, updates will be provided to the American public because of the, quote, national security importance of this matter, and in every attempt to provide transparency. That's the end of the statement. Messaging aside, the question here is whether Trump and his advisors got out over their skis in declaring that the U.S. strikes obliterated Iran's nuclear program. And it's a good question, Ben, given that Iranian leaders have made indications since the strikes that they're bent on rebuilding the program. We're going to continue to track this closely in the Threat Status Daily newsletter, Ben, including the development in the days after the U.S. strikes in which Iran's parliament unanimously passed a law that would, if it's approved by the Iranian supreme leader, it would end any future Iranian cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency. That's the UN's nuclear watchdog agency. Why would Iran do that if it was not scrambling to rebuild? I mean, it is possible that one reason could be that Iranian leaders don't want UN nuclear inspectors coming in and actually verifying the extent of the damage from the U.S. strikes, damage that may well be very profound. But my own assessment is that Tehran wants to move as quickly as possible to repair the sites. and salvage the nuclear program, and it doesn't want the IAEA getting in the way.
Guy, you kind of touched on this with the Pete Hegseth press conference just a few hours before we record this on Thursday afternoon. He pushed back hard on the media here and the reporting that's been done around the damage of those strikes achieved. And one of the most interesting subplots of this entire ordeal has been the respective domestic media narratives that each side of the story, Israel, Iran, and the U.S., are essentially trying to promote. If you're living in Iran and don't have access to news outlets outside of state-controlled media in Iran, you might think that Iran just scored a decisive victory over the U.S. and Israel. In some ways, it reminded me of the figure that we came to know as Baghdad Bob during the early days of the Iraq War, Mohammed Saeed al-Sahaf, who was the information minister of Iraq and sort of rose to fame or infamy with these reports about how Iraq was defeating the invading American forces, saying U.S. troops were dying in their tanks, etc. Statements that bore little resemblance to actual reality on the ground. I'm not sure that the recent comments by the Iranian supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khamenei, rise to that level. But this week, he did declare victory over Israel, and he said that after the failed Iranian attack on Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, that Iran, quote, slapped, unquote, America in the face and can do it again. None of that seems, of course, to be true at all. The Israeli military, by most accounts, has near complete air control over Iran. And, I think U.S. military officials said that at one point last week, they were able to seemingly hit at will any site virtually they wanted to. Iranian military leadership was devastated by Israeli strikes. And the American attacks, while the exact level of damage, as you say, Guy, isn't clear, it is clear that it struck a major blow to Iran's nuclear program in one form or fashion, to one degree or another. Iran's attack on Al Udeid, on the other hand, seemed mostly performative. President Trump said they even warned the U.S. about it beforehand, and there were no casualties, and it essentially did no damage. So I get, the supreme leader doing this for domestic consumption, news consumption purposes, trying to save face. All leaders, I think, do that to one degree or another. But it was a stark reminder to me of just how radically differently, the same events can be viewed depending on who's shaping the narrative in one given country.
Interesting, Ben. All of this brings up the issue of how hard it is to get actual accurate information about what's really going on inside Iran, politically especially, given the authoritarian style censorship imposed on media there. One thing we're tracking, Ben, amid a lot of talk in recent days about whether or not the Trump administration supports a policy of regime change in Iran. The president hinted that he did, then he said he doesn't. He kind of went back and forth on it. Anyway, what we're tracking is any information coming out about the status of Iran's 86-year-old supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. There are reports, specifically from Reuters news agency, that a top clerical body appointed by the Ayatollah has accelerated its work in recent days toward identifying his successor. And there are two frontrunners. One is Mr. Khamenei's 56-year-old son, Mojtaba, and then the other is Hassan Khomeini, the grandson of the Islamic Republic's late founder, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. We're covering it in the Threat Status Daily newsletter, Ben. One last thing real quick on a totally separate front. We highlighted this week how Japan's military conducted their first ever missile test on Japanese territory in the post-World War II era, obviously. They tested a surface-to-ship short-range missile. This marked a significant inflection point for Japan, which historically has avoided military shows of force under its pacifist constitution, but has engaged in a major defense buildup in recent years amid expanding Chinese military muscle flexing in the region.
Yeah, it's interesting. Guy, quickly, before we move on to our interview with Mark Lewis, I have to touch on President Trump's attendance at this week's NATO Leaders Summit in The Hague. And there's a lot here to get through quickly. Substantively, first and foremost, a pledge from NATO nations to hit 5% of their GDP annually on defense spending, other than Spain, apparently, which indicated it doesn't think it's realistic to get there. This is a big deal because Trump has made NATO defense spending a huge piece of his foreign policy, as we've talked about a lot on this show over the past year and a half. He's long argued that Europe needs to spend more, to do more for its own defense instead of relying on, the Cold War era model in which the U.S. military provides the lion's share of security for the continent. Now, what really struck me here, in particular with this visit, is the difference in tone this week and how that seemed to get results on a number of different fronts. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte praised Trump repeatedly publicly and privately in some texts that Trump was eager to share about how Trump was the only one who could have gotten this done, the GDP, the 5% target. Rute even made this offhand comment, which I'm sure a lot of our listeners are familiar with now, which he referred to President Trump as the, quote, daddy, unquote, who had to step in and settle a fight between Israel and Iran. I think that's been blown a little bit out of proportion in the media, but nevertheless, still worth noting. But perhaps more important, I think, to me at least, Guy, was Trump's meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and how different that seemed to be from the disastrous Oval Office meeting a few months ago. For starters, of course, Zelensky wore a suit to the NATO leaders meeting, which is a pretty notable departure from his usual attire. And he went out of his way to thank the U.S., to thank Trump for America's support for Ukraine in its war with Russia. And what was the result of that? Trump said he's going to see if the U.S. can make available some additional Patriot missile defense systems. Those, of course, would be crucial for Ukraine to fend off Russian air assaults. So we're kind of in a different place here, right? Peace, of course, hasn't happened the way Trump indicated that he thought that it would quickly and easily after he took office between Ukraine and Russia. He's appeared really frustrated with Russia and President Putin specifically at multiple occasions over the past few months. So I think Zelensky and Mark Rutte realize that. And even if maybe it's hard for them, behind the scenes to feel like they're swallowing their pride, it does seem like they both understood the right course of action right now, at least this week, is to cozy up to Trump, compliment him, shake his hand, smile, give him at least some of what he wants, and hope that the U.S. returns the favor. And we are joined now by Dr. Mark Lewis, the president and chief executive officer of the Purdue Applied Research Institute, the nonprofit applied research arm of Purdue University. Dr. Lewis has held positions across the federal government, including as the acting deputy undersecretary of defense for research and engineering, the Pentagon's senior-most scientist, and he is one of the world's leading experts on hypersonics, which we'll talk a lot more about here in just a minute. Dr. Lewis, thank you so much for joining us here in the Threat Status Podcast.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Of course. Well, let me start with this. Dr. Lewis, I first met you back in 2019 when I attended a hypersonics conference at Purdue. And I went back and looked at some of the stories I wrote off of that conference. And in one of them, I quoted you at the time saying this about U.S. hypersonics vis-a-vis China, quote, "We did their homework for them. They built on our efforts. They read all of our papers," unquote. That's always kind of a key point hanging over everything we talk about with hypersonics, especially as it relates to the idea of China being ahead of the U.S. But I think you're uniquely qualified here to maybe take us a layer deeper on that. How did China steal our homework, so to speak? Are we talking about just outright intellectual property theft, or Chinese students studying here and then taking their educations back home to work for the CCP? Were we too sloppy with unclassified information, or maybe all of the above? With the benefit of hindsight, where did we go wrong on this?
So the answer is yes to all of the above. So I think we went wrong in a couple of ways. One was a bit of hubris. We thought that this was a field that we had created, we developed, we owned it. I don't think we could have conceived of someone else basically leapfrogging us in this technology. So that's one thing that we did. I think we were a little bit, frankly, in some ways, we were a bit lax. I mean, we published papers openly that in retrospect maybe shouldn't have been published so openly. China notoriously steals intellectual property. They will do it, they will, exfiltrate information. They're kind of shameless about that. And hypersonics is certainly an area that they've in which they've done that. And frankly, also using some of the open literature. I like to point out, I'll step back and say, we spent a lot of time writing, we collectively, the community, writing position papers about the role of hypersonics in future warfare and how important it will be. And then we didn't believe our own papers. So we published this stuff out there. We told the world, hey, this is an important area to invest in. And then we kept taking our foot off the gas. We'd invest and we'd stop. We'd invest and we'd stop. So in some ways, we made it easy for our competitors to pick up in the field.
So one more big picture question on that, since you mentioned, competitors. I also went back in 2023. You testified before Congress on the heels of some, failed attempts by the Russians to use hypersonic weapons in Ukraine. You said, "quote I think the best message I can draw is that the Russians build really crappy weapons," unquote. Now there have been other uses by the Russians of hypersonic weapons since then, of course. But does that broader message still ring true with respect to both Russia and China? Sure, they may have stolen our homework to some degree, but to put it bluntly, are they just not as good as we are at turning this technology into products to use them, or are they actual peers right now today in 2025?
So I think you have to draw a big distinction between Russia and China. So Russia has mostly built on a Cold War legacy. They resurrected programs that they had shut down in after the end of the Cold War. If you look at the weapons that they refer to as hypersonic weapons, they're not especially sophisticated. And the good news is the Russians haven't been using them in a particularly clever way. So I argue it's more messaging than military effectiveness that they're after. It's like, we've got these weapons and we're going to use them. I will say that I think the Russians accomplished one bit of messaging success, which is after they used their hypersonic weapons in Ukraine and they didn't work very well. I had people in the Pentagon ask me, well, so the Russians used hypersonic weapons, they didn't work very well. So does that mean all this stuff about hypersonic weapons it's all hype because they're not really very effective? And I'm thinking, oh wow, score a victory for the Russians in that one, because that was entirely wrong. That was exactly the wrong message to draw. Now,
I saw some headlines to that effect, and news stories as well. Is hypersonics a bust? Is it a waste? All waste of money. So it's interesting how that conversation sort of turned in that direction.
Yeah, exactly. Now, China's a whole different story. China has invested very, very heavily. They've developed new programs, which they love showing off to us, by the way. They have taken concepts that we've developed, that we've published, and they ideas that we had for weapons. They have developed into weapons. So China is a very different story than Russia, and I have to tell you, my hat's off to China. I mean, they have identified hypersonics as a key area for their investments. It's a national level effort. One measure of that, by the way, is the number of universities in China that are working in hypersonics. The number of papers that they're publishing openly in the open literature, which is an indication of the magnitude of the efforts across the board.
Mark, it's Guy Taylor. We were honored to have you on stage at the recent Threat Status Golden Dome for America event that we hosted in Pentagon City. Much of the discussion focused on unique threats posed by hypersonic missiles and how the U.S. needs to build a system that can defend against those threats. Can you walk us through why hypersonics, as opposed to more conventional missiles, are such a grave threat or difficult technical threat?
When I like to point out today, when we use the phrase hypersonics, we're actually using it as a shorthand. What we really mean is hypersonic maneuvering, those two traits combined. And the reality is that any intercontinental ballistic missile is likely traveling at hypersonic speeds. That goes back to the things that we were building in the 1950s. The difference today is we're looking at high-speed systems. And, hypersonics is defined as flying typically in excess of about 5 times the speed of sound. So today we're looking at these high-speed systems that are designed to use aerodynamic forces to maneuver in the atmosphere. And that's key. So if you look at a traditional intercontinental ballistic missile, by its very nature, its trajectory is primarily governed by gravity, the laws of physics and gravity. That means if I see where that missile launches, if I see its initial trajectory, I've got a pretty good idea where it's going. I have a pretty good idea what the rest of its trajectory will look like, because it's not going to be doing a lot of maneuvering. So you see the launch, you have a pretty good idea what the target is. That doesn't make it easy to stop, and it makes it easier to stop as compared to a hypersonic weapon, where it is able to maneuver, it can bank, it can dive, it can glide. And so that means if I see it launch, I really don't know where it's going, because later in the trajectory, it can use aerodynamic forces to change its trajectory.
So would that be the definition of a hypersonic glide missile, or is that something else?
Let me step back. There are actually several different types of hypersonic weapons. Hypersonic systems aren't a single thing. They tend to fall in two general categories. the boost gliders and the air breathers. So on a boost glider, I have a glider without an engine. It's a hypersonic configuration, and it's on top of a rocket. So the rocket fires off, gets that glider up to speed, then the glider typically separates and glides to its target. On an air breather, I have a jet engine, and we call it an air breather because there's a hole in the front, there's an inlet. Atmosphere comes into the front of the engine. It has oxygen. There's oxygen in the atmosphere that burns with the fuel, so you get combustion inside the engine, and that produces thrust. Those are the two approaches. Either one of those can maneuver. For the larger scale systems, for the medium range hypersonic missiles, they tend to be the boost gliders. So, for example, the United States Navy CPS programs, the Army's program, those are large boost gliders. The Air Force has a smaller boost glide program, the Arrow program, that they just recently announced they're resurrecting. Thank you. And then they also have a cruise missile program, which is an air breather system.
And the missiles that, and I know this is really fluid in the news now, but the missiles that Iran has been firing at Israel, these would be considered hypersonics because they are ballistic missiles.
Yeah, so they're not using aerodynamic forces. They're not doing these sophisticated configurations. So let me explain, if I can, let me explain some of the science behind these hypersonic maneuvering vehicles. So in order to travel in the atmosphere at high speeds, I need to have an aerodynamic shape which has very low drag. It has to slice through the atmosphere cleanly. But what does that mean? That means that they tend to be very slender shapes. The challenge is a slender shape typically has a sharp leading edge. The sharper my leading edge, the hotter I get. It's a fundamental problem in hypersonic speeds. When you travel at high speeds, friction with the air causes your surface to heat up. And the peak heating occurs on the sharp leading edges. So a shape that travels cleanly through the atmosphere that has low drag is also a shape that gets really hot. And that's the technical challenge.
Well, let's turn it around. If we're talking about Golden Dome and a futuristic U.S. missile defense shield, how does that relate to core principles technically that this Trump administration might want to adhere to as it proceeds with Golden Dome?
Right. So if we're building a Golden Dome that's going to defend us against adversaries that have hypersonic capabilities, that makes the problem much more difficult. Right now, if I want to build a defense system that's going to defend against a ballistic missile, what do I need to do? I need to be able to identify the launch of the missile. I need to find it. I need to fix it. I need to track it. That's easier to do if it's ballistic. Because again, with a ballistic system, if I see it launch, I have a pretty good idea of where it's going. If it's a hypersonic system, that tracking problem becomes much more challenging because I don't know where it's going to go. It can maneuver, it can bank, it can dive, it can glide. So stopping it becomes a challenge. Now, there's another element to this where hypersonics complicates the problem. There's a classic solution in dynamics that tells me that it's more difficult. The defender has a more difficult time than the offensive system. And the reason is that the defender, the system that's trying to stop the offensive system, has to be more maneuverable than the thing it's trying to stop. It has to be about 3 times more maneuverable. So if I have a missile that has maybe, 5 Gs of maneuverability, the thing that stops it, the bullet that I'm going to stop that missile with, has to have 15 Gs of maneuverability. If I've got a hypersonic system, it's much more maneuverable than if it's a simple ballistic. So that means the defensive system has to be even more maneuverable. So all of this complicates the Golden Dome problem.
Let me jump in. Speaking of complications with the Golden Dome, I want to ask sort of from the structural or bureaucratic side, if you will, because look, you served in the Pentagon. You know how many various offices and stakeholders and panels and commissions and task forces can pop up when you have a project as ambitious as this one. Now, President Trump, we should mention, has tapped Space Force Vice Chief of Space Operations General Michael Gutlein to oversee the entire Golden Dome effort. But to put it bluntly, is the government capable of doing this in a cost-effective and timely way, or are you worried, based on your decades of experience both in the government and with this technology, that the United States isn't agile enough to do what needs to be done here?
So one of my favorite pieces of wisdom that I got when my first job in the Pentagon was the Department of Defense has a really hard time doing easy things, but often has an easy time doing hard things. We have examples where we have tackled really hard problems and have exceeded and excelled. Operation Warp Speed is a favorite recent example, right? When we were rolling out the COVID vaccines, we had people estimating, it's going to be 5 years before these vaccines are available. And the Department of Defense led the effort, working with other government agencies. But as you know, those vaccines were available in a very, very short period of time, months, not years. So we have shown that when it's important enough, we can move quickly. I'll also tell you, I couldn't imagine a better person to lead this effort than General Gutlein. So he understands the technology, he understands the organization. I mean, talk about the right man for the right job. So I've got a lot of confidence. It is a sporty timeline, no question about it. But we have risen to this challenge in the past.
Mark, let's spin this forward a bit. Hypersonics have been at the forefront of these discussions around weapons capabilities and missile defense for decades at this point. What comes next? What's on this futuristic horizon that you see as a scientist and a researcher that you might be excited about isn't necessarily in the news so much?
So I'll tell you what I'm most excited about. I'm most excited about the fact that this technology works. And I had a friend who used to joke, hypersonics is the future and it always will be. Well, it is the future now and it's here. And the technology works. We've got the propulsion systems, we've got the high temperature materials, we've been able to build these things and fly these things. So what comes next is actually producing these things at scale. And to me, the biggest technical challenge that we've got is to get the cost of these systems down so that we can afford to produce them in the numbers that we require. And we're seeing a lot of efforts along those lines. In terms of next directions for the technology after the weapons applications, well, you start opening up applications for hypersonics across the board. High-speed aircraft, unmanned systems, manned systems. And maybe, down the line, spin-offs to commercial technology, spin-offs to space technology as well. So we're just seeing the beginning of this technology. It's kind of an exciting time.
Dr. Mark Lewis, thank you so much for joining us here in the Threat Status Podcast. Really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week, weekly segment here on the show where Guy and I each identify a threat, whether it's here at home domestically or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting U.S. national security right now this week as you listen to the show. Guy, my threat of the week is nuclear contamination or fallout or pollution, whatever you want to call it, from military actions happening now in or around nuclear facilities. Of course, the most immediate example is what's happening in Iran, as we just talked about, with both U.S. and Israeli strikes on uranium enrichment sites, storage facilities, centrifuges, and the like. Now, the IAEA has said so far there's no real reason for concern between some potential low-level localized contamination. But in other words, there's not a Chernobyl kind of situation right now where people get sick or die from radiation poisoning and huge swaths of territory are uninhabitable for decades. But I do want to point this out. There was a new study out from the Center for Strategic and International Studies think tank that I often rely on for information and analysis. And this line from that study jumped out to me. The study said, quote, Operation Midnight Hammer, the June 21st U.S. strikes on Iranian nuclear sites Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan may represent the ceiling of what conventional force can achieve on Iran's nuclear targets without triggering broader fallout, unquote. In other words, if we want to do more, either the U.S. or Israel, the risk for nuclear fallout goes up, possibly dramatically, and that's a big concern. There's also concern in Ukraine at the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, which has been occupied by Russian forces since the early days of the war. Both sides have accused the other of launching attacks in or around the facility. There was a fire at one of the plant's cooling towers last year. Thankfully, no contamination. But those are just two quick instances, Guy, of how modern day warfare might be getting dangerously close to sparking a nuclear catastrophe, which, of course, would cause a lot of human suffering and property loss, and also be seen as an act of war in and of itself. that would surely spark more retaliation. So it's a big deal, and that's why it's my threat of the week.
Absolutely, Ben. My threat of the week is a little bit less tangible, and it's that China is on the verge of surpassing the U.S. in the development of quantum computing. We had a story this week about how Dennis Mandich, a former U.S. intelligence official and now the chief technology officer at the New York-based data protection firm Crypt, that's QRYPT, testified before Congress that the world is, quote, likely going to experience a DeepSeek moment in quantum computing, end quote, where those outside China will suddenly become aware of China's tech prowess. This could shock global markets, Ben, because national security professionals are wary that the potential arrival of a cryptanalytically relevant quantum computer, these are actual terms that get thrown around, and some listeners will be very familiar with them. A crypto-analytically relevant quantum computer. If that happens, it could render encryption-secured financial systems obsolete while also chewing through encryption systems that hold state secrets, Ben.
Quantum computing, AI, hypersonics, China's making strides, dangerous strides on a number of different fronts. So thank you for that. Huge thanks to Mark Lewis from Purdue University for that great deep dive on hypersonics. And a big thanks, of course, to all of you, our listeners. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, share with all of your friends. Guy and I will be off next week for the July 4th holiday, but we'll see you again in 2 weeks here on the Threat Status Podcast.